This is the BBC World Service, and on our website you can explore more of our programmes, from documentaries to science. Listen and download at any time by going to bbcworldservice.com. On air, online and on smartphone, this is the BBC World Service, the world's radio station.
Welcome to Newshour from the BBC World Service. Hello, I'm James Menendez. Russian forces seize Ukraine's biggest nuclear power plant after firing on it. President Zelensky says it was a deliberate attack.
The Russian tanks knew what they were firing at. They directly hit the plant. This is terror on an unprecedented level.
Russia's denied that, but there's widespread condemnation at an emergency meeting of the UN Security Council. Also today, defiance from the mayor of Ukraine's Black Sea port of Mykolaiv as Russian forces attack.
We will fight. People in the city, they want to fight with the Russians. They are prepared for the street fights.
And a new law in Russia that threatens up to 15 years in prison for spreading false information about the armed forces. We'll talk to the editor of a Russian TV channel that's had to close. He's had to leave. All of that and more after the news.
BBC News with Sue Montgomery. As fighting continues in Ukraine, Russian forces are making slow progress against sustained Ukrainian resistance. They have taken areas along the Black Sea coast and are possibly planning an amphibious assault near Odessa. Analysts say President Putin has failed to achieve his initial objective of quickly overwhelming Ukraine's major cities. Here's our security correspondent, Frank Gardner.
In the south, his forces have achieved some success, surrounding the town of Mariupol while subjecting it to intensive shelling. In the north, slow Russian progress has met stiff resistance, and their forces have reverted to traditional doctrine, pummeling a city, encircling it, and waiting for it to collapse from within. Two things, though, are baffling analysts. Why hasn't Ukraine attacked the Russian convoy poised north of Kyiv, and why hasn't it used what's left of its air force? The most likely explanation, they believe, is that Ukraine is wary of Russia's air defences and may be waiting for its forces to come in closer before unleashing what they have left in their arsenal.
The G7 group of leading industrial powers has condemned Russia's attacks on Ukrainian civilians and civilian infrastructure, promising to hold those responsible for war crimes to account. The US Secretary of State Antony Blinken, who was at the meeting in Brussels, warned the world should prepare for long drawn-out conflict.
Unfortunately, tragically, horrifically, this may not be over soon. We have to get to the point, together and with so many other countries around the world who are united in their abhorrence of what President Putin has unleashed, we have to sustain this until it stops, until the war is over, the Russian forces leave, the Ukrainian people regain their independence, their sovereignty, their territorial integrity. We're committed to doing that.
The G7 foreign ministers called for the swift implementation of humanitarian corridors, agreed by Russian and Ukrainian negotiators on Thursday. The BBC has temporarily suspended its operations in Russia after Parliament there introduced new legislation that threatens journalists with prison sentences of up to 15 years. Here's Liliane Landor.
Because we have been caught in the Spencer movement, with our site being blocked and the legislation being signed off, and we expect Putin to sign it off tomorrow, we've decided let's just take stock, assess the full implications and decide what to do. In the meantime, our BBC News service in Russian will continue to operate from outside Russia. If we continue to be blocked, if we continue to be told that you cannot use the word war, we cannot comply with Russian law and at the same time serve audiences that have relied on us in their millions.
World News from the BBC. The Ukrainian government says that in addition to conventional warfare, it's facing constant attacks on its cyberspace. The official in charge of cybersecurity, Viktor Zhora, said the attacks were targeting Ukrainian government and infrastructure networks. He also acknowledged Ukraine had launched its own campaign of cyber attacks against Russia, supported by several 100,000 volunteers at home and abroad. Joe Tidy reports.
We know that there are hacker groups who are hacking Ukraine. We also know that there are a lot of hacking groups attacking Russia as well from inside Ukraine and again around the world. Not to mention, of course, the hacker collective Anonymous have waded in as well. But one thing we haven't really had so far is an insight into what's happening on the ground in Ukraine in terms of cyber. And this was a good insight for us from the deputy chair of the SSS-CIP. And he said that the tactics have changed as well in the last few days. They are no longer just attacking government and military websites, they're also attacking the officials who work for those places as well.
The cost of gas on wholesale markets in Europe has surged to record levels due to continuing uncertainty over supplies from Russia. Supply concerns are also affecting the oil markets, with the price jumping by up to 5%. In other news, the U.S. Supreme Court has reinstated the death penalty for Zhokhar Tsarnaev, who was convicted of the deadly 2013 Boston Marathon bomb attack. Its ruling overturns an earlier Court of Appeal decision. However, President Biden has ordered a moratorium on federal executions. Tributes have been pouring in for the legendary Australian cricketer Shane Warne, who died at the age of 52. His management company said he suffered a suspected heart attack. Adored by millions of fans worldwide, Shane Warne was considered by many to be the greatest spin bowler of all time. In a glittering Test career, he took 708 Test wickets. BBC News.
I'm James Fernandez. Welcome to Newshour from the BBC World Service. We're coming to you live from London. And it is once again a programme dominated by what's happening in Ukraine following Russia's invasion last week. And those Russian troops are continuing their advances in various places around the country, but perhaps not as fast as they'd like. In a moment we'll hear from the capital Kyiv, and later in the programme we'll talk to the mayor of a port city who tells us that so far Russian forces have been repelled. But we're going to start by talking about an alarming development last night when Ukraine's biggest nuclear power plant was shelled and then captured by Russian forces. It is the subject of an emergency meeting at the UN Security Council today. Speaking shortly before that meeting, the Ukrainian President, Volodymyr Zelensky, said Russian forces had deliberately targeted the plant.
Russian troops attacked the largest nuclear power plant in Europe. It's maybe 6 times the size of Chernobyl. The Russian tanks knew what they were firing at. They directly hit the plant. This is terror on an unprecedented level.
US Ambassador to the United Nations Linda Thomas-Greenfield said Russia was putting its own troops at risk by attacking the plant.
We call on you to withdraw your troops and weaponry from Ukraine. We call on you to respect Ukraine's borders, its people, and the UN Charter. We call on you to respect your own troops enough not to send them into an unjust war or on a suicide mission against a nuclear power plant.
Speaking through a translator, Russia's ambassador to the UN, Vasily Nebenzia, claimed it was Ukrainian and not Russian forces who'd caused damage to the nuclear complex.
I'd like to emphasize once again that the danger to the civilian population of Ukraine is not emanating from Russian troops. It is coming from Ukrainian nationalists who are holding the civilian populations of a number of large cities hostage and carrying out acts of sabotage and provocations, one of which is what we are now discussing. After that, they attempt to blame Russia for all of it. Yesterday's incident at the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant is a clear illustration of this.
Well, let's go live to Kyiv and talk to the BBC's chief international correspondent, Lise Doucet. Lise, it must have been hugely shocking when news of this attack on the power plant filtered through.
James, when people in the capital Kyiv wake in the morning, if they sleep at all, the first thing they check, and they're pretty well mostly underground unless they're bearing arms, the first thing they check is their phones to see if Russian troops have reached the center of the city, if their relatives are still alive. Every morning there seems to be bad news coming from somewhere. But even by that standard, to wake to news that a nuclear plant nearby, the largest nuclear plant in Europe, just narrowly missed what would have been a huge catastrophe, you have a sharp intake of breath. And not just over what happened, but over, of course, what could still be to come.
Yes, I was going to say the risk still persists, doesn't it, with other nuclear plants around the country?
To read the reports, and for those who didn't sleep, it would have been a night of breathtaking terror, and that is why world leaders around the world were on the phone to President Zelensky. There must have been a sharp intake of breath that literally shot around the world when they heard this plant there was shelling near the plant, because the first reports were that they couldn't. The Ukrainian rescue services couldn't get into the plant to stop the fire, and the fire, which it was found out later, was at a training center, but risks reaching the plant itself. They couldn't get in because the Russians would not stop shelling. So the first report I saw when I woke up was the Ukrainian foreign minister begging the Russians, stop shelling so we can stop that. By the broad light of day, it turned out that it wasn't the main center, it was the training facility. The most explosive part of it, the reactor, had not been touched, but it was so close. As the ambassador to the United Nations of the U.S., Linda Thompson-Greenfield, says, by the grace of God, the world narrowly averted a nuclear catastrophe. The words of President Zelensky were, it would have been 6 Chernobyls, and I think most of our listeners know what that means.
A quick word, Lise, on the situation around Kiev and what's happening to that huge convoy of Russian tanks. I mean, has it advanced at all?
Well, that is the other ominous thing about the capital. This huge serpentine convoy stretching for miles seems to have stalled, is possibly bogged down, less than 20 miles away for many days now. So it injects this dark foreboding in the capital. What is that convoy going to do? It's bristling with tanks and troops and artillery. It's said to be coming toward the capital. There are various explanations. Are the wheels stuck in the mud now that the snow has melted? Have they run out of food? Have they run out of fuel? Is it restive Russian forces who don't want to advance? Or is it deliberate? Is it just sitting there ominously as the people of Kiev night and day read the horrific accounts coming from cities and towns elsewhere, being pounded by Russian artillery or warplanes, being encircled by Russian troops such that they are running out of food and fuel, that people can't have their injured be rescued to go to hospital, and they can't bury their dead. In Kiev, the center of Kiev, except for the explosions around the rim of the city, and I have to say, it was a constant refrain today, the barrages of explosions that we heard constantly, the air raid sirens, but the center is eerily quiet while they watch what happens not so far away.
Lise, thank you. That was our Chief International Correspondent, Lise Doucette. Well, the attack on the nuclear plant did, of course, ring alarm bells around the world. There is the risk of a massive leak of radiation, of course, in these situations. Also risks to Ukraine's electricity supply. And the Russian invasion more widely has raised profound concerns about Europe's energy security, given how much it depends on Russian oil and gas. Sanctions, although not directly on energy, are also having an impact. I've been talking about this with Amos Hochstein, Senior Advisor on Energy Security at the US State Department. He knows Ukraine well, having served on the supervisory board of its energy company Naftogaz. First of all, what's his reaction to Russia's attack on that power plant?
Well, I think it's unconscionable for, even during a war, attacking a nuclear power plant is just unimaginable. I think this whole war is unimaginable, and I think that's why we had all of us in the United States, Europe, and around the world had such a difficult time believing that he could do such a thing. But I think that as we go through the days of this war, the escalation of what Vladimir Putin is willing to do to achieve his goals, using munitions, cluster munitions, and now attacking a nuclear power plant, which could result, really tragic results in horrific circumstances, it's just unconscionable.
More widely on energy security, what do you think the ramifications of the invasion will be on that energy security and indeed energy prices around the world?
Look, we have implemented sanctions between the United States and Europe and our allies in Asia in an unprecedented way because the unity is what makes it successful. But there are two elements that make sanctions successful. One is making them as multilateral as possible, and the second, making sure that you are hitting the intended party, Putin and Russia, and not ourselves. And so I think the energy piece is the trickiest part of it, because that is the only thing their economy has. The Russian economy has been so mismanaged under Putin that is all that's left is things that come out of the ground, natural resources, so oil, gas, coal, metals, minerals, and that's it. And what we're seeing now is, even though we have time and again have stated very clearly that we are going to allow for transactions in oil and gas to continue, the market is essentially self-sanctioned and does not want anything to do with Russia's oil.
Just to be clear on that, I mean, you're saying that you're opposed to specific sanctions on oil and gas supplies?
No, I'm not saying that. I'm saying that we have to look at, when we get to the issue of oil and gas sanctions, what we've done so far is try to sanction pieces of that industry while allowing and enabling the transactions. If we can continue down that road while we continue to mitigate the concerns for the U.S. economy, for the European economy, and the global economy, I think that's going to be the best and most effective way to hit the Russians and make it clear that there are consequences to their actions.
I mean, if President Putin, as the president of the country and therefore in charge of the economy, if he is making, I saw one estimate today, about $700 million a day from selling oil and gas abroad, if we were to say, look, this war isn't ending and it's not going to end soon, and we have to hit the Kremlin where it hurts, and just simply say we're not going to, those revenues have to stop because they're paying for the war, could that happen without a huge economic shock around the world? Is the answer no?
No, I think the answer is yes. And again, I'm saying we have to develop these sanctions so that we do what you just said. We have to hit him and Russia where it hurts, while also making sure that we don't pay a price to such a degree. So think about it this way. If he cuts his exports of oil by, a third or X%, but the price rises by a significant amount, then selling less but receiving the same revenue doesn't really do us any good of hitting Russia. It only hits ourselves, because he will always be able to sell to certain parts of the market that are not joining our sanctions, such as China and other countries. So what we have to do is we have to continue to do what we've done so far, is to be very smart about this. We are hitting Russia in a way that has no one has imagined, definitely not the Russians. And we are looking constantly at taking more aggressive measures and invoking more pain on Russia, but we are also always looking at how can we do it in ways that only he suffers and not the Europeans. President Biden said it very clearly, we're all going to have to take some pain in this.
And just on that, one final question. Is there a danger that as Russian troops take control of more areas in Ukraine and more facilities, is there a danger that they could then cut off the gas that transits through Ukraine? Is that a possibility?
It is absolutely a possibility. We monitor that very, very closely on a daily basis. And that's why we are looking at what would be the alternatives to making sure that Europe not only has been able to get through this winter, but to ensure that we have enough supplies coming over the next spring and summer so that there are enough supplies for next winter. That is critically important. But you're right. There are more cards to be played here on both sides.
And that was Amos Hochstein, Senior Advisor on Energy Security at the US State Department. You're listening to NewsHour from the BBC World Service. Still to come on the programme, we'll discuss how the conflict in Ukraine could be brought to an end and the hard choices that may have to be made.
We do have to think long-term about what sorts of deals are going to be acceptable here, and that means nobody getting exactly what they want. We then start looking for what kinds of bargains could everyone live with, even if it's not their preferred choice.
That's coming up in half an hour. Our main headlines this hour as fighting continues in Ukraine. Russian forces are continuing to face stiff resistance, with the governor of Mykolaiv saying Russian troops have been driven out of the city. We'll hear from there in about 15 minutes. And G7 foreign ministers have condemned Russian attacks on Ukrainian civilians and have promised to hold to account those responsible for war crimes. This is James Menendez with Newshour live from the BBC. War in Ukraine is also an information war, and the Kremlin has intensified its efforts to control the narrative of the conflict and silence dissent. New legislation has just been passed, making the spreading of what the authorities call fake information about the armed forces a criminal offence, with penalties of up to 15 years. Russian media have been told to only call the invasion a special military operation. Well, all that's led to the BBC to temporarily suspend its operations in Russia, and two of the last independent Russian outlets have closed down: the radio station Echo Moskvy and the online TV station Dozhd, also known as TV Rain. Tikhon Jazgo is Dozhd editor. He's now left Russia. So is that it for the channel?
I think it is for now. You could say the same about Russian journalism, but I'm absolutely sure that it's not the end. But in these circumstances, it is impossible to work as an independent, normal media outlet in Russia, because you have two options. Whether you lie and you don't tell all the truth to your audience about the war in Ukraine, or you shut down and stop operating. We choose this second option.
And the new law that's been brought in, quite apart from the fact that you were actually closed down by the authorities, the new law would have made it impossible for you to do independent reporting of the war, right?
Yes, exactly. That's why we chose option number 2, because of this law. If you tell your viewers or your listeners or your readers the truth about the war, you could face 15 years in prison. So it's an act of military censorship. It is something that Russia, I think, haven't experienced in years or in tens of years. That's just terrible.
I mean, it feels like the Soviet Union again, doesn't it?
Absolutely, absolutely. And this war on words, like if you say war, you're a criminal. If you say special military operation, you're not a criminal. If you say invasion, you're a criminal. That's just ridiculous. But it would be ridiculous if it didn't mean up to 15 years in jail.
So what does that mean for you and your colleagues, your staff? What are you going to do?
Well, me and some of my colleagues, we decided to leave the country, at least for some time, because the situation now is very dangerous for independent journalists, especially for those who reported about war in Ukraine. We want to look now how this situation is developing and then make our decisions, but it's not safe to be in Russia anymore, unfortunately.
Yes, and indeed, the BBC today has announced that it's suspending operations out of Moscow too. I mean, Russian media has been under pressure for years, of course, but is this the end of free, independent reporting in Russia?
Well, I don't know whether it's the end or not, but of course it's the new level of repression. We've never experienced something like this. It is a new level of attack on freedom of speech by authorities, but even in these circumstances, I am still pretty optimistic when I look into the future. I just don't think that the system, with stupid and crazy restrictions like this, could survive for long.
Will there still be opportunities for Russians who want to seek out alternatives to find out what's really going on in Ukraine? Will they be able to do that?
I think yes, because there is a very important thing. There is a huge request among Russian people to the independent alternative information. I am so sure because I know the numbers of our audience, and I am sure that people will find ways to get this information.
Tikhon Jazgo of Russia's TV Dozhd. The UN Refugee Agency says that 1 million people have now fled Ukraine since the Russian invasion began, almost all of them women and children. More than half have gone to Poland, coming from or passing through the western Ukrainian city of Lviv, just over 40 miles from the border. Lviv isn't occupied for now, but there are people living there who know all too well what it means to be invaded, as Fergal Keane now reports.
This man from the local administration is telling people it's okay if you just have a Ukrainian passport, you will be able to cross the borders. And that's a signal, really, of the cooperation that is now developing between Ukraine and Hungary, Poland, Slovakia, these countries along the borders, Moldova as well, of course, because people are leaving here trying to go to any border post they can to ensure that they're going to be safe. They're fleeing towards a Europe of democracies and union, forged in the aftermath of the Second World War. This extraordinary building that I'm standing in front of was built during the final times of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Nobody knew, of course, that this was a dying epoch in Europe, the age of the great empires. But I'm standing in front of it now and watching thousands of people, as I have for several days, flooding in, hoping to get on trains to get away from here. So much history has happened in this city, which has always been half west, half east, a place fought over by different empires. It was Austro-Hungarian, it was Polish, it came under Nazi rule, then came under Soviet rule. The song from 1939 is called Only in Lviv. It evokes a city then on the edge of a catastrophe that neither singers or audience could have conceived. Here were terrible pogroms directed by the Nazis against Jews, and roundups and murders of gypsies. Among those now fleeing are large family groups of Roma gypsies. I met one family who just arrived here from the embattled eastern city of Kharkiv. The father's name was Pavel, and around him 6 or 7 young children, his wife, Sofia, and a larger extended family, all wanting to get to the Polish border. What is it like in Kharkiv? The war? It's difficult, Pavel told me. Everything is burning, everything is destroyed. No one is listening to us, no one wants to help us. His daughter Sonia says, it's terrible. Of course you can't draw exact historical parallels, and one has to keep remembering that both Ukraine and Russia suffered appallingly in the Second World War, the civilians of both countries. History casts a long and deep shadow here. I'm going to go and see somebody at a centre which has been set up to help the Jewish community of this city in this time of trauma. 84-year-old Tatiana Zabramnaya is a Holocaust survivor.
I asked my mom about the war, what, when and why, but she could not tell. She could not tell it without trembling, without crying, and asking not to be reminded about the war. My uncle and my aunt were in Kiev, and my mother told me they were shot. Who would have thought that, like in June 22nd, 1941, we would be invaded again, but from Russia. It is terrible.
At the railway station, amid the crowds thronging to leave, a young refugee from Kharkiv sang a Ukrainian ballad. It's called There Is Hope. Lviv's history is a story of survival, but also of war's immense and continuing cost.
That was Fergal Keane reporting there from eastern Ukraine, and we'll be hearing from Lviv at the end of the programme. Newshour's Tim Franks has just arrived there. He's going to be talking to us ahead of a few days of reporting from the city. You're listening to Newshour.
This is the BBC World Service, where we're looking at human nature.
I'm Dessa, the host of Deeply Human, a guided tour through the wilderness inside your head. An investigation of human instincts, culture, and biology to find out why we do what we do. This week, dancing. From rain dances to raves. Why do our bodies react to rhythm?
You will experience that point where you just completely leave your body. It's like I'm at another location in the room, and then I'm watching myself dance.
Why does music move us?
I moved a little easier and lighter, and I felt a little lighter. Dance is both therapy and a way to elevate my spirits.
I'm looking at the neuroscience of music and movement.
The connections in our brain can synchronize their firing to musical beats. When we move, we tend to connect to the sounds and to the vibrations.
Deeply Human at bbcworldservice.com/deeplyhuman.
Coming up on Newshour in the next 30 minutes, we'll talk to the mayor of the Ukrainian Black Sea port that repelled an incursion of Russian forces today. Also, more on the shelling of Ukraine's largest nuclear power plant. We'll talk to the energy ministry. We'll also hear from the US Secretary of State, Antony Blinken. And we'll hear from the city of Lviv in western Ukraine, where Newshour's Tim Franks has just arrived. All that's coming up after the news.
BBC News. As fighting continues in Ukraine, Russian forces are making slow progress against stiff resistance. In the south, they've taken areas along the Black Sea coast and are surrounding the port city of Mariupol. The governor of Mykolaiv says Russian troops have been driven out of the city, but fighting is continuing on the outskirts. Analysts say President Putin has failed to achieve his initial objective of quickly overwhelming Ukraine's major cities. The G7 group of leading industrial powers has condemned Russia's attacks on Ukrainian civilians and civilian infrastructure, promising to hold those responsible for war crimes to account. G7 foreign ministers said the humanitarian toll of the unprovoked and unjustifiable war was catastrophic. They called for the swift implementation of humanitarian corridors. The BBC has suspended its operations in Russia after the introduction of new rules threatening journalists with prison sentences. Its Director General, Tim Davies, said the BBC News Service in Russian would continue to operate from outside the country. President Putin has told the German Chancellor Olaf Scholz that Russia is open for dialogue with Ukraine, but only if all its demands are met. Mr. Putin denied that Russia was bombing Ukrainian cities, dismissing the evidence as fake. Mr. Scholz called on Mr. Putin to halt military action and allow access for humanitarian aid. The UN Security Council is holding an emergency meeting to discuss the safety of Ukraine's Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant after it was shelled and then captured by Russian forces. In other news, the U.S. Supreme Court has reinstated the death penalty for Johar Tsarnaev, who was convicted of the deadly 2013 Boston Marathon bomb attack. His ruling overturns a Court of Appeal decision that vacated his death sentence. BBC News.
Welcome back to Newshour. The response to the refugee crisis unfolding along